in Napa is that the vineyard can actually become more famous than any individual maker. And you fantastic. I know you have prepared, got a presentation with some images and so on. Do you want to talk us through actually the Monte Rosso vineyard and what's sort of special about it, and sort of show us those images?
Yes, I'd love to. Let me know when you can see my slides.
Okay, just bear with us one moment. Bear with us one moment. That's Michael, we just got a few. Yes.
Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I did have a couple pictures here just to kind of give some visual to the story. So this is Louis M. Martini on the right and his son, Louis P. Martini. So our founder came over right around the turn of the century to join his father as a fisherman, but ultimately found his own passion in winemaking and worked throughout California in various places, but ultimately landed almost dead in the middle of Napa Valley in a town called St. Helena, where he built the winery we're in today in 1933. And I know from, I have to admit that as an American, our sense of what is old is very different than anyone who is from Europe. We think things are old at a much younger age than Europeans tend to. But for California, we really have been around quite some time. 1933, I'll remind you, for those who aren't aware, is the year that Prohibition ended in the United States. So Louis M. Martini, our founder up in the top left there, was kind of a visionary, but also very opportunistic. I would say, I don't know which he was stronger in, vision or just identifying opportunities. Maybe those go together. But he had a solid dose of both and built his winery as Prohibition was coming to a close, which was when alcoholic beverages were illegal in the United States. But ultimately handed over to his son, Louis P., who was a very, very different personality. He was probably the most scientifically analytical, rigorous of the three Martini gentlemen. Also very, very quiet, as opposed to his father, who was very gregarious, quite a personality from what I understand. But Louis P. ultimately handed the reins over to his son, Mike Martini, who we mentioned I had worked with. And Mike Martini was more of although he went to UC Davis, where I got my master's, Mike Martini was much more artisanal and actually brought a lot more traditional techniques into the winery. So the winery had not really used small barriques or barrels. Mike brought those in. He started fermenting longer periods of time on the skins. So each of the gentlemen really contributed their own mark to the winery. But the Monte Rosso vineyard was purchased by our founder, Louis M., in 1938. So just 5 years after he built his winery. However, go ahead.
Chris, could you put the view onto the slideshow? It's just it's not clicking through onto the. Are you sharing this? Or it's just one moment. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, it does.
Oh. Would you mind doing that? Thank you. Thanks. Right. Sorry. Carry on. We now have you're talking about the Monte Rosso vineyard.
Yes. So the Monte Rosso vineyard was purchased. Louis M. purchased fruit off of Monte Rosso for a few years and really saw the potential. And he ended up buying the vineyard in 1938. So just 5 years after he built his winery. But really, to understand Monte Rosso, we need to go back even further, because the Monte Rosso vineyard was developed and planted by the Goldstein. So Emmanuel Goldstein was a fairly successful grocer, and he and his son purchased what later was named Monte Rosso in 1880. And just to ground you, I talk about these dates And like I said, from an American perspective, this is a very long time ago. But I have to remind myself the context. In 1880, Edison patented the light bulb. So this is before World War I. This is when motion pictures are just being developed. So very, very different time. But they planted the vineyard roughly 1886. And in fact, we have some of those original plantings. We have one block of Semillon, Old Vine Semillon, which is the oldest Semillon in North America, and older than the Zinfandel, which is what we are a little more well known for. The Zinfandel vines are just a few years younger than the Semillon, so 128-ish years old. But there are a lot of things that make Monte Rosso very unique. And so I think the map's important. For those of you who don't know Northern California geography, directly to the south of this map is the San Francisco Bay. And the San Francisco Bay is a critical part of both Napa and Sonoma County climate, because that large body of water really provides a moderating influence. So cooling during the summertime and warming, if you will, during the wintertime. But Monte Rosso sits up at about 1,000 feet elevation. Oh, yeah, we've got it in meters there. I was going to say, shoot, I don't know if I can convert that on the fly, but luckily the slide has meters. It's at elevation in a mountain range called the Mayacamas, and the Mayacamas are what separate Sonoma Valley from Napa Valley. So where you see Monte Rosso, it's actually in Sonoma County, but just barely outside of the Napa Valley AVA, or American Viticultural Area. It also sits fairly far south in the Mayacamas, which means that it gets, because of both the elevation and because of its proximity to the San Francisco Bay, it gets a very, very cooling effect. So it's a relatively cool site. However, because of where it's situated, the aspect or the tilt of the vineyard, it varies between blocks, but generally speaking, it's tilted toward the southwest. And what that means is that during the summer and then approaching harvest time, you get very, very direct, intense sunlight. You get that afternoon sunlight, which is when the berries, the clusters, are a little bit warmer in temperature. And so you get this ripening effect that gives you a very, very ripe profile. But because of that cool climate, you maintain a lot of vibrancy and acidity. And of course, anytime you're in mountain soils or at elevation, you tend to have more intense structure as well. So from a tannin standpoint, in red wines, the wines are much more structured, but very, very tight and fresh because of this acidity. So from a climate standpoint, that's one of the things that makes Monte Rosso unique. But the second thing is the soils. And as the name kind of suggests, and in 20 seconds or so, you should see my slide switch, Monte Rosso means red mountain. And it is called that because most of the blocks on the ranch are on what you see now, this very, very deep red soil. So it's very iron rich, right? When iron oxidizes, it becomes iron oxide, which is rust. So that's that rust color is due to a very high iron content. And, I certainly don't believe, nor can I suggest that iron travels through the vines and gets in the berries. There's no reason to believe that. However, I will say that whether it's just coincidence or not, sorry, I lost my visuals here. Can you still see my slide, Sarah?
We can see the slide that says the red soils.
Great. Because I am having a little trouble seeing you guys now. At any rate, these very red soils really contribute a character to the wines. In particular, I would say the Cabernet. So in Zinfandel and Cabernet, I find two Monte Rosso characteristics, if you will. In Zinfandel, it gives this unique spiciness and a unique spicy character. I would call it similar to a peppercorn, but more of a green peppercorn. So it's this kind of spicy green. In the Cabernet is naturally very layered and complex, but one of the hallmarks for me is this kind of cast iron pan, or like a very rare steak. It has this iron-like minerality, as opposed to, more of a chalky mineral quality. It's this iron-like minerality, as well as fruit, of course, but also these amazing herbal tones, which I believe may be partly due to some of the surrounding flora. We have in California what are called California bay trees. These are not the bay tree, the bay laurel that you would use in a culinary sense, but it is related, and it has a kind of minty bay quality to it. These oils in this tree are very, very volatile. And so I think there's a contribution between both the natural flora of perennials and annuals that grow, as well as the surrounding trees that lend some of the personality to the wine. So those are really the things from a viticultural perspective that kind of, in my opinion, really contribute to the fingerprint of Monte Rosso. And
can I just ask you, just looking at this photograph of the vineyard, it's an extraordinary looking vineyard. This deep red soil, and then it almost looks like an orchard. The way these vines are individually, are they individually staked?
Yeah.
And what height is the fruiting zone?
The fruiting zone, sorry, I'm going to say feet. The fruiting zone is roughly 3.5 feet high. So this is what we would call head trained, head pruned. This is a very classic planting methodology. And all the old vine Zinfandel on the ranch is planted like this. The oldest block of Cabernet I didn't mention, Cabernet Sauvignon was not the predominant variety. Napa Valley is now known worldwide for Cabernet Sauvignon. But at this time, in the 30s, it was not the predominant variety, because much of California viticulture had come from Italian families. And so it was a different collection of varieties. And I make, I want to say 12 different Cabernet Sauvignons. It's really what we focus on and what Martini has come to be known for. But Louis M was the one to plant the first Cabernet Sauvignon on Monte Rosso in 1940, and that block still exists. It is head trained, cane pruned. So a little bit different system than this. There are some wires to support those canes. And that is one of the blocks that most vintages will go into the single vineyard Cabernet Sauvignon.
And when you come to cultivate these vineyards, these very old vineyards, do you have any special considerations? Like, for example, are the vineyards on Monte Rosso, are they grafted or ungrafted?
The old vines are ungrafted. I'd have to look back in some records to see when grafting really started to become predominant. But you have a great protection in that, even though this is a mountain site, some of these soils are actually, you can see they're quite loamy, and these soils are quite deep. So you have developed root systems that are very, very deep. And that really gives a resiliency to those old vines that they wouldn't have otherwise.
And does the fact that they're ungrafted, do you have to take special precautions? Do you wake up at night worrying in case someone treads phylloxera into the vineyard? How do you manage, if you like, this kind of almost heritage viticulture site? Is it something that's really integrated into the company policy? I mean, how do you work with that? Because you also have vineyards which are not so old, don't you? I mean, you've expanded a little over the years.
Yes, we have, and we have had to replant blocks that were unhealthy. So the Cabernet Sauvignon that I'm making now off of Monte Rosso is actually a collection of block ages. And I'll be honest, as we were kind of forced to redevelop some of these blocks, I was concerned about whether we would be able to get a similar quality and whether or not the personality of the vineyard would still shine through. And I was absolutely elated when one of the youngest blocks, which was replanted about 6 years ago, 7 years ago. In its second vintage, it actually made the Monte Rosso Cabernet Sauvignon blend. So you have a real span of ages from that 1940 planted block of Cabernet Sauvignon all the way up to something fairly young, and then some core blocks that were planted in the 70s and 80s. So it's really quite a range. Cabernet Sauvignon's a little trickier because Cabernet is very susceptible to eutypa. And that is part of the reason that we cane prune that very old block that naturally helps to manage and control eutypa. Zinfandel is not nearly as susceptible, and so it requires a little less care, but certainly when you're working with vines this old, you have to be very thoughtful about the cuts you make, right? Pruning cuts are, by their nature, damaging to a plant. It's a wound, and you have to be very thoughtful about any time you need to make a cut to older wood, so not the last year's growth, but wood that is older than a year. You have to take precautions, and that sometimes has to be done, but we have to use protectants to prevent that infection of eutypa, et cetera. Those are really the biggest considerations, is really thinking about the health of the structure of the vine and preventing infection.
And it's very interesting you should say that, because we've had a couple of speakers on in previous old vine conferences, viticulturalists and then consultants like Marcus and Annette Dylan Grigg, and they are specialists in the viticulture of old vines. And it seems that there is a kind of re-evaluation of the idea. So if you like, some pruning orthodoxies that have been brought about through what people have learned in basically cultivating old vines. Is that an experience that you're familiar with, or have you always treated the old vines, differently when it comes to the approach to pruning?
Yeah, I don't know that I'd say we treat them differently. I would say that we treat them with more thoughtfulness and precision because of their age. And I think I like to talk in analogies. They're very helpful for me. And I do think there is a good analogy to people. And as we as humans age, how we treat ourselves and our bodies and our minds has to become more thoughtful if we expect to stick around. So I'll be 50 this year, and I'm certainly thinking about longevity and how I treat my body. And so I think it's very, very similar with old vines. You have to really think about them a little bit more intently and handle them with, at least conceptually, a little more gentility, if you will. Now, that being said, these Zinfandel vines, some of these blocks that are 128 years old, are quite healthy. And frankly, many vintages, we still have to drop crop. So these vines are able to set a pretty healthy crop still. So I don't think they're going anywhere soon, but we certainly are very thoughtful about ensuring that we're going to hand off this vineyard to the next generation in the best condition possible.
That reminds me of, we had a comment from Andre Morgenthal, who's heading up the Old Vine project in South Africa, and they have this initiative that's come out of their work called Planting to Grow Old, which is essentially thinking about the old vines of the future, what they've learned about how to manage vines from observing old vines that are healthy and thriving, and how to apply that learning to vineyards that they're planting today. When you come to replant the vineyards on Monte Rosso, how do you go about it? Do you do it sort of vine by vine? Do you anticipate a replanting? What material do you use to replant? How do you sort of plan for that eventuality? And is it different for the different varieties?
It is a little different. I think it begs an interesting question, because at least in the United States, we often talk about old vines, and there is this presumption that as vines get older, they produce better wine. I can tell you I've worked with some old vines that produce really terrible wine. So it is not at all a, presumed fact. And in
Bye-bye. No, I'm just kidding.
and in fact, I had a industry acquaintance once who suggested something that I thought was really a compelling kind of thought experiment. And it actually wasn't his idea. He had gotten it from somebody else, but this person suggested, what if it's not that old vines make great wine, but great wine makes old vines? In other words, if you have a site where the vines are reasonably healthy and the wine quality is outstanding, whether it be because of the training, the original training, the soils, the clonal material, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all those things come together to produce an outstanding wine, why would you rip it out, right? It is both costly and a lot of effort and a loss in production to take vines out. So perhaps the wine isn't great because the vines are old. It's just something to think about, but actually the vines are old because the wine is great. And I totally forgot your question, but I went off on a slight tangent. I think, yeah, replanting, right? There are a lot of considerations with replanting. There's certainly the economics. What are you trying to do from a business perspective? There is also the winemaking viticultural aspect of what can we do to reflect the personality of the vineyard, especially when you're talking about a vineyard that goes into single vineyard bottlings. But there's also new techniques, right? We have information and technology that the Goldsteins did not have. They did something pretty intelligent, but I would suggest some of that was probably by luck. And we now can do soil analysis. We can dig pits and understand the soil profiles. We have more rootstock availability. We have more clonal selection availability. So we can really be a lot more detailed about what we do. And we actually have one block that sits in a section of the vineyard that kind of rolls up and down. It's a very long block, but you have these slight hills and swales. And in the swales, you have a little bit more vigor. And up at the top of those hills, even though they're not dramatic, the soils are thinner. And so we have variably spaced vines. The vines in the heavier section are spaced further apart because you have more capacity in those vines because the soil is richer. And then as you approach those tops of those knolls, the vines are tighter. So the idea is to manage the vigor across the block because it is a long block. It naturally needs to have the rows running the length of it, but that is also the exact line across which there is high soil variability. So it's very, very site specific, what we in particular do. We haven't done a lot of head trained, head pruned vines, although we did plant some Grenache that is trained like that. And so, yeah, it really is quite variable depending on the specific block. Like any reasonably sized vineyard, there are blocks and plots that have greater potential from a quality perspective than other blocks. And so we think about that too. What is the potential of this plot? And what could it do? What is its, moment to shine? Where is it going to contribute to the portfolio?
And another thing I'd like to ask you is whether you work with what the Australians would call heritage cuttings. So where when you come to replant, what material do you use? Do you also see a value in the genetic material of the old vines, and do you work with that in a kind of selection style, or are you working with nursery vineyard stock?
So a whole mix. With Cabernet, it's a little more nursery clonal material. We have not replanted Zin in quite a while, so we haven't had to kind of tackle that concept with Zinfandel. I will tell you that with Petit Syrah specifically, and we have a decent amount of Petit Syrah on the Monte Rosso vineyard, we actually have used a clonal material from the back of the winery in St. Helena. We have some Petit Syrah, and this is a clone that came from the mayor of St. Helena, the town that we're in, many years ago. And it really is, that vineyard produces a very unique Petit Syrah. For those who aren't really familiar with Petit Syrah, it's very dark, very tannic, structured, big wine, perhaps a little monotone, if you will, at times, kind of the singular dark fruit note. But that clonal material or that site behind the winery, we call it Toman Station, the vineyard, produces remarkably plush, velvety Petit Syrah. And we have used that clone at Monte Rosso, and I got to tell you that both that material and other Petit Syrah materials we've used still make a pretty tannic Petit Syrah on Monte Rosso. So there's no escaping the effect of the site. And Petit Syrah of Monte Rosso is a beast. It is muscular, tannic, far more so than, say, the Cabernet Sauvignon. So it's very much an individual consideration depending upon the site and the variety, et cetera.
Thank you. I've got one last question for you, which is kind of sparked by the tasting and the discussion we've had. Okay, so something terrible happens. Obviously, I don't hope something terrible happens, but you could say your Cabernet Sauvignon old vines or your Zinfandel old vines. What would you say?
Wow, that's almost an unfair question.
You don't have to answer it. I mean.
No, I like it. I enjoy unfair, difficult questions. I would probably, I'm at heart a very analytical, scientific person. And depending upon how we define old vines, actually it doesn't matter much how we define it. There is far more old vine Zinfandel material on Monte Rosso. Even though Cabernet Sauvignon, we have more acres planted, there's more old vine Zinfandel. And so just from a mathematics standpoint, and the fact that the Zinfandel is significantly older than any of the Cabernet Sauvignon, and Zinfandel really is, I know it is not originally from California, but it very much is for us a California pride kind of variety. And is it tied into so much of our viticultural heritage in the entire state? I would definitely save the Zinfandel.
Thank you. Yeah, I must admit, I think those wines are both sensational, but there's something about the Zin, it just has that deep sense of personality, which is really compelling. And also, I think there's something about the Zinfandel, which is one of those kind of Cinderella varieties that is transformed by being old. It's like the kind of the vacuum in town, and then suddenly it comes back after a few years of age, and everyone realizes it's actually the hero, the secret superhero. But I'm not a very scientific person, as you can probably tell. But thank you, Michael. It's been absolutely great to have you join us. Does anyone have any questions for Michael? I know we're running slightly over time. If anyone thinks of any questions, they want to follow up, do let us know. We can always pass them on.
How do we go on with that question, Sarah?
Yeah. Have I done it?
No, that's great. I thought I might.
Thank you. The wines are tasting brilliant, and thank you for your support and being part of this community and sharing your insights. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. I was thrilled to be able to join and love what you guys are doing. So thank you very much.